reflection's based on this week's lectionary reading, which is John chapter 2, verses 13 to 22. It's a story of Jesus entering the temple and throwing out the people who were exchanging money and selling sheep and goats and birds for sacrifice. Now, if you know your Gospels, you'll probably know that other Gospels put this in the last week of Jesus' life. But here's John placing it right near the beginning. Now, it isn't that one is right and the other is wrong. We don't really know the actual timing of this incident. The important thing is to John of its meaning. Now, John's Gospel is very carefully constructed. The stories he chooses to tell and the order he tells them in all have a meaning. He states in chapter 20, verse 30, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples that are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So each of the stories that John chooses and the order he puts them in are all chosen for this particular purpose. Now, John's is the gospel that starts with the statement that Jesus is God. Jesus is God who became flesh and lived with us. The first sign that John records is of Jesus at a wedding where he turned water into wine. He took the jars of water that were there so that people, the guests, could wash their hands doing the ritual washing that was required by the law. He took them and he turned them into the best quality wine for people to drink. So what he took was something of an outward ritual and turned it into something of real quality that we take inside and that affects us from the inside. And this is a symbolism of what Jesus came to do. The new covenant that we have through Jesus is something to do with a change of our heart, a change in our very inner being. It's not about religious practices. So the cleansing of the temple then does tend to follow very naturally as the next story to tell. The heart of our relationship with God is our worship. Temple worship had become rather ritualistic and also rather corrupt. Now, the structure of the temple included an outer courtyard, which was known as the courtyard of the Gentiles. The idea was that non-Jews could come into this court and they were encouraged to come there, and they couldn't go any further, but they could see the worship that was going on, and the idea was that it would draw them in to worship the one true God. Now, this is where the people set up their stalls, where they were changing the money, where they were selling the animals. And rather than encouraging Gentile people to see the worship of the one true living God, it would be something that would rather put them off. They had to change money, their money from whatever country they were, they had to change that into temple money to pay a temple tax. And that in a way is a form of exclusion. It's saying your money's not good enough. You come here, you've got to have our money. But much worse than that was that they were actually charging exorbitant rates. So they were making money out of what should have been a service, and it was excluding people who couldn't afford it. Others were selling sheep and goats for sacrifice. Now, the animals to be sacrificed were meant to be perfect, without blemish. And so these sellers were stopping people from bringing their own animals. They'd say, no, that's not good enough. You have to have one of these special animals. And again, charge high prices for them. They were taking advantage of honest worshippers. So any Gentile coming to draw near to God would have been put right off. And it's no wonder Jesus was angry. The worship of the one true God had descended into this. But there's something more symbolic here too. It was Passover time. Now, this was the time the people remembered how God had rescued them out of Egypt, out of slavery, and given them freedom in their own land. On that night, they were to slaughter a lamb, they were to roast it and eat it, but they were to put some of the blood of the lamb on their doorpost, because the angel of death was going to pass through Egypt that night, and the angel would pass over the houses which were marked with the blood of the lambs. So Jesus goes at Passover time, and what they were doing at this Passover time was remembering that story, but also at 3 p.m. on Passover day, they would slaughter the Passover lambs in the temple. When John tells the story of coming into the temple, he drove out the sheep, the goats, the doves that were used for sacrifice. And this is symbolic of Jesus coming to the temple, the heart of worship. Animal sacrifice was no longer going to be necessary. Jesus was to become the one and true Passover lamb, the once and for all sacrifice for sin. In fact, in John's Gospel, he places the crucifixion of Jesus on the day of Passover, and at 3 p.m, when the Passover lambs were being slaughtered in the temple, Jesus died on the cross. The true Passover lamb died on the cross. Now, it was very natural for the Jewish leaders to get a bit upset with Jesus. You know, what authority do you have to come in here and do this? They said, what sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this? But they were asking him to do some amazing sign. Instead, he just said to them, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. Now, we know the story, and so we can look back and say, yeah, of course, he's meaning his own self, and 3 days he's going to rise from the dead. But back there, nobody knew that. Even his own disciples were puzzled by what he was saying. It wasn't until after the resurrection that they began to cotton on what he'd been talking about. Now again, this is an important truth. The temple was the dwelling place of God among his people, but it was to be replaced by Jesus. We know that when Jesus died, the curtain that was curtaining off the most holy place in the temple, and that most holy place was the very presence of God. Only the high priest could go in there, and he could only do it once a year. A very holy place. But as Jesus died on the cross, that curtain was torn, ripped from top to bottom. Now that was not the hand of a person, because that curtain was so thick and so heavy that it took 300 priests to hang it. This was an act of God, because Jesus' death was to open up direct access to God for those who commit themselves to Jesus. How this access works, well, there's a good picture given on the Alpha tapes. I don't know whether it's on the new Alpha course, but certainly in the older ones. During the American Civil War, there was a soldier sitting on a bench in Washington and looking rather glum. A young man went up to him and sat down with him and sort of asked him what the problem was. And the soldier explained that he had a family member back home who was very ill. He wanted to get back home to visit him, but his commander wouldn't give him leave. So the young man listened, and then he said, well, come with me. So the soldier went with him, and they walked up to the White House. And to the soldier's amazement, when they got to the gates, the guards just opened the gates and let them through. So they walked up to the front door. And again, to the soldier's amazement, the guards just opened the door and let them through. They went right up to the Oval Office, and the young man knocked, and a voice inside said, come in. So they opened the door, and the president was sitting there at his desk, and he looked up and he said, and what can I do for you? And the young man said, Dad, this soldier needs your help. Our relationship with Jesus is what gives us access to the Father. Jesus wasn't actually just coming to cleanse the temple, he was coming to overthrow it. Now, it took another 40 years, but the temple was eventually completely destroyed by Rome and has never been rebuilt because it's not needed. The dwelling place of God is no longer in a building, it's in all the lives of those committed to Jesus. Placing this story near the beginning of the Gospel is John's statement of who Jesus was and what he came to do. The stories that follow need to be understood in the light of what this is saying. Now, there are two things that stand out for me. One is that worship is not a thing of ritual. It's something that has to come from within, come from our very hearts. And just as Jesus judged the shallowness and corruption of the temple worship, he'll be just as likely to judge the shallowness of worship today. Are we worshipping God truly from our hearts? The second thing is our need to have relationship with Jesus. Jesus is the only one who can lead us into the very presence of the Father. And it's only through his sacrifice that we have that right. And so I pray that God bless each one of us as we seek to grow in our relationship with Jesus Christ.
When the music fades and all is stripped away, and I simply come, longing just to bring something that's a word that will bless your heart. I'll bring you more than a song, for a song in itself is not what you have required. You search much deeper within than the way things appear. You're looking into my heart. I'm coming back to the heart of worship, and it's all about you. It's all about you, Jesus. I'm sorry, Lord, for the things I've made. When it's all about you, it's all about you, Jesus. King of endless worth, no one could express how much you deserve. Though I'm weak and poor, all I have is yours, every single